here at the Natural Capital Lab. We're going to get started in a sec. We've got a few more people who are joining the webinar, so we're just going to let those who are joining in get stuff set up for the next minute or so. And then I'll go through and do a little introduction and welcome our panel speakers for today. Okay, there'll likely be a few other participants who join in as we're going forward, but for those who've come in on time, I just want to respect that. I'm just going to start off with a little bit of housekeeping. One of the things I'll do is I'll have our panel speakers just on mute, so that when I pass the ball over, we can hear them nice and clear, but otherwise we won't have too much interference or background noises. From a housekeeping perspective, the way we're going to work our webinar today is similar to the others. If you've got questions, so we're going to ask participants just to type in their questions in the question box on the right-hand side of the screen. And then what my colleague Nancy and I will do is just go through those questions and begin to respond to them either by typing or by asking you to ask your questions to the panelists. We're going to keep everyone on mute too, just to make sure that you can hear our panel speakers for today. We do have a couple of survey questions that we've worked into to the webinar today, just to get a sense of who is on the webinar and also to get a sense of the work that you're potentially doing in this space as well. So our speakers today, this is our lovely group with the exception of my colleague Nancy, who is our communications director and has helped make this webinar and all of our lovely communications material on the website possible. So I just wanted to recognize her great work. So today we'll be hearing from Roy Brook from the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative, Michelle Monlar from David Suzuki Foundation, and Emmanuel Machado from the town of Gibsons. And I think it's actually going to be in the reverse order of which their images appear. I'll just do a quick introduction and overview of the Natural Capital Lab and what we're trying to accomplish, and then I'll pass it over to Emmanuel to go through some of the amazing work that they've been doing with the town of Gibsons, and Roy as well, who will then speak a little bit more about the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative, who we're collaborating with as part of the Natural Capital Lab. And then he'll pass it to Michelle. So Emmanuel, Roy, and Michelle have done their song and dance a number of times, so there won't be a clear-cut passing of the ball, if you will, but they will be able to provide a nice fluid overview of the work that they've all been involved in, which is quite exciting. And then we'll save some time at the end for question and answers. So on that note, one of the first things I'd like to do is just get a sense through the polling question that we're going to put up to get a sense of what people's backgrounds is that are on the webinar. And I apologize, as we only have a few options. We can't put up a whole long list of options. The system only allows us to do about 5. So this will give us a sense of how many roughly the background that participants have who are on the webinar. So let's wait for another 10 seconds, and then or 5 seconds, and we'll show everyone the results of the poll. Okay, we got most people who voted on that, so I'm just going to show the results so that you can see. So that should be up. There we go. So you should be able to see that those results. So we've got most people who are coming in from an environmental science background, some from an economic, social science, or legal background, a few on the financial and engineering side, and then 5% of others. And I'm sure, again, we can break that down in more detail, but it's nice to see a good mix of participants. And it's one of the things that we're looking for within the Natural Capital Lab, is to have good representation from different organizations. So a second polling question, and this, we've got only 3 polling questions today on the webinar, and this one is just quite short. We're curious to see who is currently working on or planning on working on projects that are related to natural capital or ecosystem service valuation. And of course, this is very broad. There's a number of different ways that you could or might be working on this, but it's just to give us a sense. Okay, it's another 5 seconds, and then we'll close it. Okay, so we've got actually, compared to the other webinars we've had, we've got quite a large number of participants here who are involved in or working on, planning to work on something related to natural capital, a natural capital initiative, which is fantastic. Moving back into our little presentation, I just want to give a short overview of the Natural Capital Lab itself, and then turn it over to Emmanuel to hear about some of the fantastic work at the town of Gibsons. So the Natural Capital Lab, it emerged out of some conversations that happened last year where we're trying to, we being our founding partners, TD Bank, CPA Canada, Cooperators, Smart Prosperity, who's recently changed their name, no longer Sustainable Prosperity, and a few others, including a recent partnership with the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative. But we brought people together to look at how we can better account for ecosystem services than we have been doing in the past. There's lots of work that has been done, but we've, I think, really failed to gain traction actually integrating the services that natural systems provide to us into decision making and into accounting practices, for example. So we brought people together to sort of tease that question out, talk about it a bit more, and identify what is required to move this forward so that Canada can become a bit more of a leader in this area. What was recommended is that we needed to create a bit of a platform, a network, which is what the Natural Capital Lab is serving as. So we have webinars and information sessions and blogs that we're posting. And if you haven't signed up for the newsletter, I'd encourage you to do so that we don't so that you're able to access those. And in particular, we're in the center of this is that we're really trying to bring together influential leaders, practitioners, to build what we are saying is a sort of a cohesive or collaborative platform to advance natural capital decision-making, advance ecosystem services and natural capital into decision-making across the country. The group last year also said, we can't do everything, so let's try and, these sector work streams emerge from that. Even if we look at things from a high level, let's focus in and work on corporate, municipal, and federal, provincial, territorial streams. So we're bringing together a group of natural capital innovators on November 23rd and 24th in a few weeks to further articulate what we need to do within each of these streams. And we're very excited because there's already lots of activity. As we'll hear today on the municipal side, there's some fantastic activity that Municipal Natural Asset is involved in. On the corporate side, we'll be piloting the Natural Capital Protocol, with a few organizations who are interested in further exploring that tool. And on the federal and provincial territorial side, we have some funding in place now, although this is not our only initiative, but to help to work with the province of Ontario and organizations from Ontario to develop a provincial chart of accounts. Of course, these 3 streams there might be separate and different, but there's a lot of areas in which they intersect. So policy changes that might be required, communications campaigns and activities that might really help advance and shift the agenda. These are all things that the group will be exploring at our upcoming session. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, do let me know. I'm happy to answer questions, or you can follow up separately by email. These are some of our founding partners and funders. There's a number of other organizations that we're partnering and collaborating with as well. So in terms of that involvement, as I just mentioned, just a couple of seconds on that, we will have we've got an innovation forum coming up, and this is people who've applied to participate as a lab participant going forward. So we need to make sure there's mutual interest and benefit from organizations and people coming to the table. And from there, we'll be doing a whole series of things, including putting in place specific learning journeys to further develop skills. We'll be forming working groups who will advance, for example, the provincial chart of accounts in Ontario, or who will work on piloting the natural capital protocol, or work on other things that the group identifies in the forum. And then we'll have more of a public innovation summit into late spring of 2017, in which we'll share the outputs of this and look for additional projects and whatnot to work on. I'm just going to skip through a couple of slides here. So again, there's good information up on our website, but I want to make sure we stick to our timelines and create space for our panel speakers to go through their information. So if you do want more information again on Natural Capital Lab, do feel free to let me know, and we'll happily respond. So I'm going to shift the ball now and pass it over to my colleague, and make sure I'm pressing the right buttons here so I don't hang up on everyone. So just bear with me a second. So we're going to hear from Emmanuel, who is the city manager for the town of Gibsons and has been involved in the environmental space for a long time. I met him a couple of years ago at one of the FCM Sustainable Communities conferences, and was quite impressed with the work that the town of Gibsons has played a leadership role in. So I'm just going to pause there and pass the ball to Emmanuel. Let's make sure you're off mute so you can speak. There we go.
Thank you very much, John, and good morning, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. With me as well is Roy Brook, who's the director of the National Initiative, and Michelle Molnar with the David Suzuki Foundation, who's been helping us tremendously with the new tools and methods that we're developing to account for and manage our natural capital. Nature and the ecosystem services that it provides is a fundamental component of a municipal infrastructure system. In Gibsons, many of the key services that we deliver to our citizens are directly and indirectly delivered by nature. Our drinking water is stored and filtered in the Gibsons aquifer. Our rainwater is treated and conveyed in a system composed of soil and our tree areas and our creeks and ponds, and about over 75% of that system is still vastly natural. And our foreshore, which provides protection to public and private property, it's also thriving with marine habitat as well. And so we have tremendous examples of where nature is what provides us with services, but up until recently, it wasn't really a part of our books and our practices per se. And so we have been sort of defining a revised practice in local government that takes elements of asset management, of financial planning, and ecology, and creates this new approach. On the asset management side, it's been a very good fit. We're incorporating natural assets into our typical, more traditional asset management practices. So we've got relatively good funding. We've got trained staff and a lot of experience and tools available. On the financial side, the fit hasn't been so clear. We started looking at it from the perspective of risk and understanding our risks and what are appropriate our liabilities as well. And this new practice of valuating natural assets the current tools that we have to assess, to evaluate other assets, buildings or pipes or roads, it's not a very good fit. And so Michelle and her team has been helping us to create a valuation tool, which she'll speak about as well. And also asking questions about how to adequately fund natural assets, be it for operational reasons or for capital improvements as well. From an ecology perspective, it's probably the area that we have the least experience, but it's been, with the help of the David Suzuki Foundation and other folks, it's a growing practice for us. And this approach of condition assessments, we're trying to understand the state of the ecological integrity of the natural system, and try to also extract as much service ability from that asset without disrupting the primary ecology of the system itself. And it's interesting because it's also has allowed us to expand our scope from sustainability in general. We were, years ago primarily concerned with, the efficiency of appliances in homes and cars, and more recently moved into sort of a neighborhood scale. But to manage adequately your natural assets, the scale needs to be at a watershed level. It is simply not possible, and we need to recognize that when we sit in the most green, the most efficient building possible, that the efficiency of that building is ultimately determined by the efficiency and the health of the watershed upon it which sits on. Nature itself is undervalued, underpriced, and overused. In BC and in Canada, we're very fortunate, and it's the vastness of natural areas that we have. It's easy to take it for granted, and we lack the metrics and the standards to adequately understand the value of the services that we benefit from, and whether it's the impact in our atmosphere, our oceans, or our soil. We certainly have used, and in some cases abused, nature over a long period now. And our infrastructure is decaying at a faster rate than we can afford to replace it. FCM and other groups have spoken loudly about the fact that we don't have sufficient funds and capacity to replace the decaying infrastructure that we have in this country. And so that is actually one of the motivators for the town of Gibsons to look a little bit more broadly, and as we consider replacing particular assets, is there an natural option that we should be considering as well? And certainly are in our case. And nature itself knows no boundaries. In Gibsons, from the top of Mount Elphinstone to the ocean, there are 6 agencies that get to regulate that cubic meter of water that travels from the top of the mountain to the ocean. And we all have different standards and approaches. And I think that for our own benefits, economic and otherwise, not to mention for the benefit of nature, we need to have an integrated governance and approach, and I think we could all benefit from that. That's one of the possibilities, and we're learning some of that through our pilots. We certainly would like to test more modern governance approaches in the watersheds and in Gibsons as well. So we have this interdependence and this interconnection with nature, and but never really recognize it from a policy perspective, the value that nature has. But the town of Gibsons early in 2014 deemed nature to be its most valuable asset, and council directed us to redefine what infrastructure means to the town, to include the fact that we have this inheritance of natural capital and the ways that I described before, and that's just sort of the larger ones that we benefit from as a local government. We have since then substantially put our key documents through a natural capital lens, including also at the operational level, and are very much now working as a team in the management of these assets. The direction primarily comes day to day from the asset management policy, which also defines and recognizes the fact that we in fact have three types of assets. We have what we know as engineered assets. We have assets that are more like biomimicry type of assets. Those are things like green roofs and bioswales and others. And we still have, thankfully, many still natural assets. And they all have different approaches and considerations. And we've made allocations budget-wise and in terms of our teams to properly manage these assets. Our definition of natural capital as it relates to a local government is the features in the natural environment that provide an equivalent engineered-like service, such as water storage and filtration. And so how do we fairly represent the value of those services in our financial statements? And it's not so just a matter of having a number on a page, but it's because there are implications for decision-making in particular. On paper, we're worth around $47 or $48 million. That's what we report as having in terms of assets. But we know that we have an aquifer and several creeks and treat areas and so on that are not yet listed, and we are not being required to report on those assets. It's not a straight fit, but from our experience, we've noted that natural capital has no upfront costs, there's no replacement costs, or financial depreciation per se. It's carbon neutral by definition, and in some cases it can be carbon positive. Our maintenance of the aquifer and the stormwater ponds, it's been very affordable compared to other assets. We spend more maintaining a reservoir than an aquifer. And which we cannot say for many other assets is that if properly maintained, these assets should last in perpetuity. And just as importantly, provide many functions beyond just the engineered service itself. Perhaps an even more important question is whether we can afford not to maintain these assets. You know, we've had quite a fall weather-wise, and after a storm, the natural assets recover relatively quickly, and we've had to do very little in terms of work around there, which cannot be said for some of the piping systems that we have in the ground from the 50s and 60s, which weren't designed to accommodate the types of weather that we have in these days. And if we are relying on nature to treat and filter our drinking water, what is the level of comfort that we're prepared to accept? To have a bit more comfort with our aquifer, as an example, we work with Waterline Resources out of Nanaimo, BC, great group, and they have helped us put together a monitoring plan in a monitoring program so that we can, with a bit more comfort, get a sense of the quality and the quantity of the aquifer, as an example. And from a financial perspective, if there's any issue with that aquifer, what is our financial plan to seek a different source of water for our nearly 5,000 residents? So these are some of the questions that we have to think through. Our goal ultimately is to have infrastructure that is the most natural, the most reliable, and most energy efficient, that costs the least to operate over the long term. I will now pass over to Roy to explain how our pilots are currently running, and Gibsons is in essence the living laboratory for the pilots. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, and thank you very much to everyone who's on the line. So Gibsons is clearly doing fantastic and exciting and leading edge work, and a key question becomes, how do we replicate it? How do we build on it? Or even can we? Or does it stay an isolated example? And Our basic hypothesis of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative is that asset management as a business practice, one which municipalities are increasingly required to implement, make it possible to replicate the kind of work that Gibsons is doing and to integrate natural capital considerations readily into municipal practices. Why? For a couple of reasons. One, asset management looks at the end point, not as building an asset, but as sustainable service delivery. So it doesn't really matter what the asset type is, whether it's built or natural. What matters is whether it can deliver services efficiently over its life cycle. The second reason that the asset management approach, we believe, is so potent is that they're consistent across municipalities, just as accounting standards are also consistent across municipalities. So even if the context between Gibsons and another city are vastly different, there's still a way to integrate and migrate the information and to consider it in an increasingly standardized way. And the third and final reason why we think it's possible to replicate this is that, as Emmanuel said, they've been having initially some trouble valuing their natural assets, but as we've discovered, there's increasingly sophisticated ways to determine what are the actual biophysical services provided by natural assets, and then based on this, what's the value of those? So next slide, please. So based on this idea, four convening partners, they're the ones whose names you can see at the bottom, set out to validate this concept. We started with a workshop last fall, multi-stakeholder, had some great input from a wide range of participants, and got support from a variety of sources once the validation had taken place, including the Real Estate Foundation of BC, Salamander Foundation, Greenbelt Foundation in Ontario, Government of BC, brought on some other partners such as Asset Management BC, and the Natural Step has since also become a very integral partner in all of this. And phase two, which you can see up there, is now underway. And I guess what I would draw your attention to is that there's the 5 pilots themselves, as well as a few other components. There's research on some what I would call cross-cutting issues. For example, how do you engage private landowners? What are the barriers at governmental institutional levels or at the level of individual professions and disciplines? Plus, across these 5 pilots, we want to ensure that there's good learning, gathering of lessons, appropriate communications, so that we can really see, okay, what's working in these pilots, what's not working, and we'll certainly find elements of both. And then, depending on how things play out over 2016 and 2017, we could scale up more broadly in 2018 and beyond. Next slide, please. So these are the pilots: Grand Forks, Region of Peel, Town of Oakville, City of Nanaimo, District of West Vancouver. We'll go into these in a bit more detail now, but the thing that I would draw your attention to probably right off the bat is that these aren't the usual suspects. Rather, this is a very diverse group in terms of size, ranging from 4,000 in Grand Forks to multiples of that in the region of Peel. Very different geography, and in many cases, very different challenges. And you'll note the caveat at the bottom that the pilots are becoming increasingly well defined, but some of the stuff you're about to hear will change a little bit over time as we get deeper into them. So, Grand Forks. This is a city, for those of you who are not familiar, of about 4,000 people in the interior of BC. They already have a strong sense of the importance of natural assets, and in particular of water-related issues. They have a high water table, they have porous soils, and they've already had some contamination and have had to shut down some of their pumps in town. What they have in the city is an oxbow wetland, so wetland basically shaped like a U, And it ties into a variety of local issues such as flooding, water quality, both for the aquifer itself and also for the fish-bearing streams that it eventually drains into, and these are vital for local tourism. These are being affected, or the wetland is being affected by climate change, for example, by land intensification. So there's service lots being taken out and turned into commercial and other uses. And so the city, it wants to understand both in practical and financial terms, how do we manage this wetland better? And so partly this requires that we identify what the wetland is physically doing in terms of the things that the municipality, in terms of the services that the municipality is interested in, so flooding, water quality. How is this being affected? And then through a financial valuation of these services, this can support a variety of things, not only costed management plans that feed into asset management strategies, but also potentially acquisition of land, new management practices, and importantly here, they're also quite interested in engaging the local citizenry. And as in all cases across these municipalities, or local governments, I should say, interested in understanding the value of the natural assets in terms of avoided capital cost. Next slide, please. So the region of Peel and the Credit Valley watershed, this is an entirely different situation. It's enormous, the entire watershed, 1,000 square kilometers with 22 sub-watersheds. Clearly not possible in the scope of this project to model the entire thing meaningfully. So 2 sub-watersheds have been identified and hived off. One is urban and one is rural. Unlike Grand Forks, there are many natural assets within each sub-watershed. For example, each one would comprise different wetlands, woodlands, green space. Water issues are already top of mind in Peel, in the Peel region. They've been doing quite a lot of work on this for a number of years. And it's top of mind because the costs are already spiraling upwards as a result of storm events that are increasing, and as well as an associated increase in infrastructure costs. So the region is interested in both costs and management options to manage and maximize some of the services that are provided in each of these sites and from the natural assets in these sites. And these include flooding, erosion, water quality, and maintaining base flow or the quantity of water. And as with the Grand Forks example, some of the outcomes would hopefully be a clear understanding of the values of these services that are being provided, different management options to maximize them, and then costed operations and management plans. Next slide, please. So the town of Oakville, also very different from the 2 I've just described, in that the area, well, from a couple of perspectives, the area of interest, which is Wellington Weir, it's in an established part of Oakville that's entirely built up. And so there's nothing that you would sort of think of as a very traditional natural asset in the sense of a wetland. We're primarily speaking here about green spaces, ditches, so grass ditches, and streams, or really remnants of earlier streams that once flowed through the area. And I think this speaks a bit to Emmanuel's point that infrastructure comprises built, natural, things that mimic nature, and this is, I think, quite evident here. The issue or the challenge in Oakville is that larger homes are being built, sort of, let's say 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 square feet, are being built up to replace older homes that were 1,500, 2,000 square feet. and putting more pressure on the existing stormwater system through a loss of permeable surface. And also what's very interesting here is that many of the natural assets are on land that is owned by individual private landowners. And so this creates a kind of a twist in what we're trying to do, because obviously a municipality can't create an operations and maintenance plan for land that it doesn't own. So some of the things that the municipality or that the town is interested in are questions like, what is the value of the lost services as new homes are put in, new larger homes are put in? What are some of the management options for the remnant streams? And I should say this in all cases, across all the municipalities, we're just looking at smaller areas so that we would answer that question in the study area, and then the municipality, the town, would have the ability to migrate everything that it's learned and the model to other parts of the city. And that's, of course, true in Grand Forks, in the region of Peel also. And then for those natural assets that are on private land or held by private landowners, the question becomes, what are collaborative options to manage these assets on private land? And there could be a range of different things that the financial understanding and the understanding of the services would give rise to. Next slide, please. So the city of Nanaimo here on Vancouver Island, this is a little bit similar to Grand Forks in that the site is an urban wetland. It's certainly not in its pristine form. It's been a farming land. There was mining underneath it historically. There's been a lot of interest in the wetland over the years from a biodiversity point of view and from a habitat point of view, but not so much on costing services to the municipality. And these include things like water quality, managing the quantity, so storing water, limiting local and downstream flooding. And also they're quite interested in the maintenance of biodiversity as a draw for residents, and the ability to moderate impacts from extreme weather events, which are becoming increasingly common. And so we're going to look at different scenarios. Again, climate change being a key variable, understanding how resilient the marsh is to future storm events, and again, hopefully coming out or predicted to come out with better management options that maximize localized the ability of the wetland to minimize local and downstream flooding. Interestingly, and as is also potentially the case in Grand Forks, this understanding could be used to justify future capital expenditures and acquisitions of new land to add to the wetland. And indeed, in Nanaimo, they had made a purchase of a big chunk of the wetland a couple of years ago, and were remarking they had to do it solely based on biodiversity, habitat and conservation perspectives, and made the comment that it would have been very useful and helpful had they had the financial case when they did. Next slide, please. So the District of West Vancouver on the BC mainland, last but not least, their broad interest is in the community is, from an asset management perspective, how to shed or get rid of more assets, because despite a recent increase in levies, they've determined more assets on the books than they can reasonably afford to maintain over the long term. And one of the things that they're therefore interested in is a stream as compared to maintaining an engineered asset. And here's the kicker, that a lot of the current engineered assets that are in the ground were built 50 years ago. And while they may still have some useful life, they are not up to today's standards and may not be performing the function that is required as the climate continues to change. So the comparison, the financial comparison, needs to be between a daylit stream and the services that it can provide. And it's, I think, well documented from an environmental point of view that streams that are daylighted may be able to provide riparian habitat, reduce peak flows, improve water quality, and so forth through the absorption into the well, just by providing habitat and through the increased level of permeable surfaces. So here in West Vancouver, they're interested in particular, is there a value to the stream once it's daylit for salmon habitat? Does it have increased value for flooding and drought mitigation? And it's covered, and it's in a non-covered form. And what's the financial value of this? And hopefully out of this, we will also have a model or a method that can be used not just in other parts of the district of West Vancouver, but potentially in other communities also. That brings me to the end of the description of the 5 municipalities. Maybe the one comment I will add is that you'll have noticed that I focused, or these focus all exclusively on water and stormwater and urban water management issues, and that is the scope of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative for now, and that over time, and depending on interest of municipalities and resources, it may well expand beyond that. And so with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Michelle.
Thank you, Roy. I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about the methodology that we've been using to really develop a framework for incorporating natural assets into asset management. Now, when we started wanting to do this, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We wanted to look to existing asset management guidance questions and frameworks such as Asset Management BCs. We wanted to look at existing ecosystem service models such as SWIM, such as INVEST, to create something that can be scaled, that's adaptable, and that can be replicated from community to community. So we decided to start with the service of stormwater management, given that it's a concern for a range of municipalities. And to do that, I wanted to build a multidisciplinary team to really get a broad understanding of stormwater management. So our team included an economist, a hydrologist, a water resources engineer, a GIS analyst, a hydraulic modeler, and a programmer. And together we developed a two-step approach to valuing the services of natural assets. So just briefly, this includes a very quick screening process that's designed to indicate at a high level whether a particular component of the environment contributes to the service of interest. And then secondly, we developed a more detailed biophysical model that allows a local government to gain a more in-depth understanding of how that wetland or that forest or that green space functions and what infrastructure benefits it provides, and then transferring those results into an economic value. Next slide, please. Okay. So assuming the screening exercises indicates that an environmental feature is in fact making a significant contribution to infrastructure services, then a municipality may wish to include it in their asset management process. So here's our framework for doing just that. I recognize it's a busy image, so I'll walk you through it. So this image is intended to demonstrate how to factor natural assets into asset management. And the central image there is Asset Management BC's framework. The circles around it address how each component of the framework can be adapted for natural assets. So starting at the top with the two blue circles, they really represent some preliminary work we're doing with pilot communities. We're working with them to flag the need for an interdisciplinary team, and we're working with them to review typical data needs so that the scope of the assessment is reasonable for the resources available to the community. The next three circles align with the assessment phase of asset management, and they're colored red to match the red in the center diagram there. Common questions associated with this phase include: what is your asset inventory? What is the value of your assets? And what is the condition of that asset? So the answers to these questions are not straightforward, and we wanted to provide guidance and tools to help answer those questions. So for instance, we identified a simplified process to identify really key natural assets. We walk readers through stormwater modeling and how to compute the economic value of a service from the biophysical metrics obtained in the modeling. And lastly, we recommend key questions to ask when completing a condition assessment. So the next two yellow circles relate to the planning stage of asset management. Topics we address in this phase include how to assess the impact on the asset from increased demand, and to consider what to consider in developing an operations and maintenance plan. Within this phase, we recommend using ecological models that allow for scenario testing so that any changes to land use, environmental management, or changes to weather patterns can be better understood. And we also highlight the novel considerations that should come into play when operations and maintenance plans are developed. Lastly, the last two green circles there relate to the implementation phase of asset management. And two key considerations here are highlighted. A long-term financial plan for a natural asset should aim to achieve the same goals for engineered assets, that is, sustainable service delivery that's fiscally responsible, while recognizing the unique characteristics of natural assets. So for instance, and Manny had referred to this, they don't depreciate if properly maintained. So is something like an asset replacement schedule mandatory here? Perhaps the maintenance and the monitoring plan plays a larger role. And lastly, I'll just say, because natural systems are so interconnected and so interdependent, adaptive management, or learning and adjusting as you go, is essential. And last slide. So I'd just like to end by providing some suggestions for those of you who are interested in exploring this concept further. First of all, you can get on our mailing list to receive updates on how the pilots are going, updates on how some of those research pieces that Roy alluded to are coming along. So if you are interested, the final slide, the next slide, will show Roy's email, and you can certainly contact him to get on that mailing list. Secondly, you can start thinking about nature as an asset and start, just at the high level, walking through some of these key questions and thinking what kind of data you need to answer them, what you have on hand, but things like, what are the natural assets in my community, and what services are they providing? What role do those natural assets play, and other key priorities? What condition are they in? What management options can we think about? How would we integrate this into our financial plans, and perhaps consider a natural asset policy similar to the one that the town of Gibsons took up? And then lastly, I guess you could work through a pre-audit package that provides a bit of an overview of what to expect, what resources are required, and how to start incorporating nature into asset management. This is something we're working on right now with the Greenbelt Foundation. We're hoping it'll be ready by the end of the year, but if not, it'll be early 2017. So next slide. With that, we also have a connection to a few background documents on the initiative if you just want to do some reading. So thank you for your time, and I think we'll open it up to a few questions.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for that presentation and overview of the excellent work that you're all involved in. I'd like to just turn it over now to the audience. We've got about 10 minutes remaining to see if there are any specific questions. And the best way to do that would be just to type in your questions in the question box. And then also, if you want to raise your hand, I'll keep an eye out for that, and then we can take people off mute so that they're able to ask their questions directly. So I do have, there are a couple of questions coming in, so we're just going to review what those are. One of the questions that emerges for me in looking at how organizations, businesses, municipalities, provincial governments are working further at integrating this into their decision making. It's some of the barriers that they're running into as you test and pilot this. So on the accounting side, I'm sure there are a number of issues or challenges that you've come up with through early conversations as to how you actually get these natural assets on the books. In some cases, it's not possible, and others it is. But I was wondering if you could speak to any of the other barriers that you've run into so far, either in the pilots or specifically with the work that you've done at the town of Gibsons, Emmanuel.
Well, certainly, thank you. I guess the main, not the main bias, but I think the first bias we tend to run into is this acceptance or this position where we simply have two choices, whether we can support growth and development or we can have conservation. And so we're trying to demonstrate through our initiative that you can actually do both. And as a quick example, in BC, we charge development cost charges to developers to support the infrastructure that we need to build due to increased development. And in our case, for the next 20 years, the infrastructure that we're proposing to expand for stormwater specifically, it will be mostly improving natural areas, planting more trees and expanding our ponds and so on. And that's guided by the work that Michelle and her team are doing. We're able to make sort of that type of decision. I think you'll run into sort of the lack of metrics. The current accounting standards we have, the PSAP 3150, which has been a very good thing to have, but we tend to raise more questions than answers as far as that goes. And the lack of standards in general, it's still a very big sort of policy area, and we've tried to be as disciplined as possible and just focusing on what we know is our responsibility in terms of providing services to people and identifying only those services and knowing at the same time that habitat and pollination and everything else is just as important will be there as a consequence. But so those were some of the barriers that we had, but so far so good.
Great, thank you. And any other barriers or things that you'd like to share? Sorry, that's to the other panelist, Roy.
Yeah, I think that.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think that the big one, certainly once we start incorporating nature into asset management at the local level, and Emmanuel had alluded to this, is that nature doesn't stop at a town's boundary. So, of course, recognizing the interconnectedness and what you're able to do, I guess, within your own boundaries, there has to always be kind of that recognition that the neighboring jurisdictions have a significant role to play as well. And, really, it's at the watershed boundary that I think this work kind of comes to fruition, I guess.
Great. So we do Sorry, Roy, any other comments? And I've got a couple
Just add
questions.
that the Public Sector Accounting Board rules at this point specifically preclude counting natural assets as an asset, and that's not something that's going to change overnight, and it's something that's going to require some work, and there's certainly workarounds, as Gibsons has been doing, so that you can still communicate the information. But that's an important policy level challenge for sure.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Yeah, and it's those are some of, as an example and a connection back to the Natural Capital Lab, one of the things that we'll be exploring with experts across the country in November and into next year are some of those key issues and barriers and key leverage points that are required to make more substantial change within how we look at the value of ecosystem services. Of course, running additional pilots is something that we're interested in supporting as well, both within the municipal business and provincial federal streams as well. We do have a question from Zita Othello. I apologize if I've not said your name clearly. I'll just take you off mute, Zita, so that you can ask your question. Please go ahead.
Hi, Emmanuel and Michelle and Roy. Emmanuel, you spoke to the need for more modern watershed governance to be able to help us respond to, what Michelle just spoke to, the fact that the borders don't end at the end of the ecosystem continues across municipal borders. And so as we start to have a better understanding of how we can value these assets through the tools and the experiments that you're running, how can you, or do you foresee a way that we have to change our decision making in order to be able to respond to that? What's a governance question, really?
Yes. Well, good morning, Zita, and thank you for your question. We have a situation of some environmental degradation in a creek that's just outside the boundaries of town, and the landowner is suggesting that development within the area of Gibsons is somewhat responsible for that. We've argued otherwise and pointed out the fact that we're downstream from 6 other, or in that case, 3 other to the top of us, agencies. These are provincial ministries and local governments as well, that have had their own influence in the ultimate ecology of the watershed. And yet we're all kind of looking within our area of jurisdiction, and I haven't found yet sort of an obvious governance approach that we could use to sit everyone down without sort of and just arrive at a solution, which is to, in our case, I think we need to understand what's happening with this watershed, and all work from the same sheet of music. We all have our own playbooks, and there isn't a common one yet. And particularly in watersheds where you have drinking water considerations in populations downstream, I think that's where we should perhaps be starting with.
Wonderful.
Well, perhaps I could add one thing to that. It's not as broad as the question Zita just answered, but the research on private landowners are vital to this, and I think we should, hopefully out of the town of Oakville example, get some ideas for, I don't know if governance is the word, governance collaborative models to work with individual landowners to protect natural assets, and also some of the research that we're doing, that Smart Prosperity is leading in all of this, will also look specifically at the question. It is scoped a little bit narrower than watershed governance, but speaks to the need to think more broadly than just what is within the scope of one municipality. Excellent.
So just recognizing the time that we're at now, I think we'll move to bring things to a close. I'm happy to stay on for a couple of extra minutes if there are other questions, but not seeing any in our question box or seeing any hands raised at this point, I think we can move to close things. Just a reminder that for those who are interested in learning more about both the Natural Capital Initiative, the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative, and the work that we're doing with the Natural Capital Lab, please do visit the websites. We will send a follow-up email around afterwards, and please do stay tuned for additional webinars and information from both of our groups. And if you have any comments or feedback for us, please do feel free to let us know that as well. We're always looking for to learn about other activities that are taking place, and also to look for new opportunities for collaboration. Thank you to our panelists again for your time today and for the very interesting work that you're all involved in. I look forward to keeping an eye on and hearing how each of the pilots is unfolding, and to being able to help share lessons learned from that as we go forward. So with that, I'll bring it to a close and thank everyone very much for their time today. Have a wonderful day wherever you are, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.